Today we're building a clock module. A very important module as it sets the pace for everything else, and keeps all of our other modules running in sync. There are two main camps when it comes to modular timing. One way is to send a constant PPQN, or pulses per quarter note signal, to all modules, and then let each individual module subdivide as it wants. MIDI uses this strategy with 24 PPQN. Crazier systems will do up to 1,000 pulses per quarter note. In the other strategy, we can do all of our subdividing inside of the clock module. In this scheme, the clock has a few different output channels, where a few different subtempos can be customized with things like pulse width, swing, and delay. I much prefer the second scheme, mainly just because I use it on my VCV rack stuff, and so here I'm more or less going to copy over my favorite clock module from VCV, which is Impromptu's clocked module, because it does everything I want it to, and overall it's just a spectacular module. We'll be making some small changes to simplify stuff, though. Only one screen, as I'm not made of liquid crystals. Only ratio and swing for some tempos. Pulse width and delay are useful, but I don't have that many different channels to use. For the same reason, no input BPM or reset or run inputs. For a later version of this, I'll maybe put in a BPM sync feature, but this is supposed to be the main clock source for my system, so everything else syncs to it, and not the other way around. And with that settled, let's get started on it. We're going to start off with a proof of concept that's as simple as possible, and then slowly build on it until we have the full module together. Our first chunk is just the base tempo that all of our subtempos will divide and multiply off of. Here we have an output jack for the tempo pulses and an input potentiometer to control the beats per minute. Hook up 3.3 volts and grounds, and then our output jack to digital pin 13 and input potentiometer to analog pin A2. Easy enough, and now it's code time. Okay, how does time work? I thought this piece of code was going to be really easy, but it took a solid amount of thinking to figure out where I'm going with this. So let's start with the BPM selection with the potentiometer. I set up the range from 40 to 200 because those sounded like fine numbers to me. Each frame we map our tempo knob's value reading to that 40 to 200 range. I probably shouldn't include this, but originally I was going to call this a projection from the knob's value, but it's not a projection because projection is an idempotent mapping, and this is a linear mapping that's not idempotent. I didn't realize that projection was definitionally idempotent, and I feel like a bad number theorist here. And going even further off the rails, because I realize I said idempotent like 14 times, and I don't know if anyone knows what that means, so here's an idempotency tangent. An operation is idempotent if you can do it multiple times and it has the same effect as doing it once. Addition is not idempotent because adding multiple times just keeps increasing the result. Whereas hitting the button at a crosswalk is idempotent because whether you hit it once or consistently every second until the crosswalk changes, you get the same result. And as much as I'd like to believe that hitting it exactly 8 times makes the light change faster, it doesn't have any effect, thus idempotent. Okay, tangent over. Now we have our tempo that we want our clock to run at. How do we make it do that? First, we set a start time to compare against and do a conversion from beats per minute to nanoseconds per beat. And quickly fix my error where I was treating it like beats per second instead of beats per minute. So it should be 60 times what that is. Time units are tough. And then all we need to do is calculate the amount of time that has elapsed in this beat specifically, take the modulo of it, and see if we're in the first half or the second half of the beat to set the signal either high or low, respectively. Easy enough, and a quick check on the TTY looks good to me. Oh yeah, and originally I didn't even notice this, but I accidentally managed to route the tempo digital output to the same pin as the onboard LED, so we get this nice blinking LED at exact tempo. It didn't even cross my mind to do this, but it's really helpful to keep track of, especially for debugging when we get into subtempos. I wish I could take credit for it, but if not for random chance, this would not be a feature. So the biggest new thing in this project is I'm using a 14-segment LED display, so we can actually see the numbers for our tempo, and later for the subtempo and swing when we add those in. I have this cute little I2C backpack for the display here, so I pretty much just need to hook up the SDA and SCL pins and use V high instead of 3.3 volts to increase the display brightness and drive the display more directly off 5-volt USB power. And I thought that the code part for setting up this LCD was going to be really hard, but I just downloaded a library and copy-pasted some code, sacrificed a resistor to the great circuit in the sky, and asked no questions, and it's working no problem. We do run up against our first thought problem here. The analog pin that we use for determining the tempo has not an insignificant amount of noise, on the order of roughly plus or minus 500, with a full range of 0 to 65,000. In our current setup of 40 to 200 BPM for tempo, we have 160 different options across this 65,000 unit range, giving us a band of just about 400 per one tick of tempo. And you can probably see our problem now. And so our thought problem is, how do we fix this? If you want to, pause here, take a second, and think about what you would do in this situation. If you think of a clever solution, let me know in the comments. My first thought here was just to decrease the number of options on the potentiometer. I don't think I really need 160 different options for tempo. We can narrow that range down to 60 to 130 and only have 70 options. And even further, we can subdivide the tempo into chunks of 5 BPM, leaving only 12 available choices, which is certainly enough to not worry about the noise. There is one absolutely enormous problem with this system though. With this plan, it becomes impossible to set the tempo to 69 beats per minute, which makes this strategy ultimately unfeasible, so I need to think of something else. Attempt number 2 at solving this problem, back to the shortened tempo range of 60 to 130, but throw in a moving average to smooth out the noise. The trade-off that we're making here with a moving average is trading lower noise for a slower response time, which is a trade I will gladly make in this scenario. And it's not perfect here, but it's certainly much better. The final trick up my sleeve that I have is to hope that the noise goes down once I move this to the protoboard and not the breadboard, but if it doesn't, then I'll come back to it then. For now, I think it's good enough to move along. Now that we have our base tempo all situated, it's time for subtempos. Lots more potentiometers, lots more complexity. And I'm only going to wire up one channel here because the second and third channels will be identical, and I'm just going to copy paste everything in the code once I figure out the first one. The subtempos provide two main challenges here, one easy and one fairly difficult. We'll start with the easy one, dividing and multiplying the clock signal. We want to be able to both divide the clock signal into less frequent pulses, like 1/4 would be a pulse every whole note, and multiply the signal, where times 4 would be 16th notes. We want to map through these numbers linearly, so it makes a lot more sense for us to use negative numbers to denote a clock division, then convert negatives to fractions to do our math. For the display, we can literally just find and replace any minus sign with a 1/, and it will look exactly how we want it to. After that, it's just a matter of multiplying or dividing our nanoseconds per beat value into the nanoseconds per subtempo flat beat value. Flat beat here to denote that we still have the harder step left to do, apply the swing value. Using the same strategy as the clock module we're borrowing from, swing is a value between -100 and 100 that denotes the percentage of swing, where 0 is no modification at all, and 100 is 2 beats happening on top of each other every other beat. This one took a second to wrap my head around, but once I found a visualization I really liked, it got a lot easier. We can think of swing as the back and forth between sets of exactly 2 beats. So instead of thinking about each beat individually, we should be thinking about groups of 2. Each group of 2 beats will be the exact same for each configuration, so we solve for a single case, we can just keep repeating that same idea over and over again. This is what's called an invariant in math, and they tend to be really useful things to find. Our useful visual insight comes with thinking about a number line of 2 beats, and about the swing percentage as progress along that space between these 2 beats. Every other beat is an invariant, and we're just shifting this middle one from left to right linearly, based on what our swing knob tells us. Now that I hopefully make logical sense about what we're doing, how do we write that into code? And I'm not going to lie here, the code is still pretty confusing, and I think I'm going to leave you with just the high-level explanation and not get into the implementation details here. It's essentially just what I described, though I think it could be better written. I might try again on this one later on. As they say, the best code is never finished. Okay, we're done with the confusing code stuff for the moment. It's time to zoom out and set up our protoboard. I'd like to thank hundreds of hours of Tetris for my ability to fit everything we need on this protoboard in a fairly clean way. It's a little bit of a tight fit this time around. The wiring continues to be just a little bit of a mess, but keeping to a color coding scheme keeps me looking professional. Here we have black as ground, red as 3.3 volts, blue signal out, green signal in, and the newly featured white as data lines. Maybe we'll see some more of that in the future. Now it's time for the moment of truth from earlier to see if the protoboard brings down our noise levels enough. And yeah, I think it helps a lot. I didn't do any numerical before and after tests to see what the exact noise numbers are now, but I can definitely say that they are less. I have conveniently lost all of the footage of me measuring where to cut our enclosure holes this time, but I used a new strategy of marking holes on a piece of paper and transferring the pattern onto the box. As you can see, the result is decent, but some improvements to the process definitely need to be made. Stay tuned for next episode where I actually remember to hit the record button. Once again, we run into the problem of utter tool insufficiency when it comes to the hole we need for the display. My solution this time around is just to cut a bunch of holes aimlessly where the display might be, and if it looks bad, I'll just call it a stylistic choice. An artisanal module. In all honesty, I think it's good to have some messed up parts to these. The point I'm trying to make here is that electronics and software are much more accessible and doable than it seems like they are, and a few things are as relatable as embarrassing failure. Anyways, let's chill out and do some painting. Today we have this pink nail polish. It goes on really light, so 2 coats are definitely required today. So it's time to sit back, relax, and do some shameless cross-promotion of my music, now available on Spotify. And that was nice. Really makes me want to buy that album on Bandcamp. Okay, we're in the home stretch now, which is good because I'm starting to get tired. This is a complicated one so far. Lots of moving pieces. We need to quickly go back to the code and copy-paste in channels 2 and 3 from channel 1. I was a little bit worried here that we were going to run into some weird memory limit on the chip from initializing like 50 different variables, but I ended up not having any problems with it at all. CircuitPython continues to exceed my expectations. If I had to use C and cross-compile and use like JTAG or something, this would be a very different video series. After enough copy-pasting to feel like a Stack Overflow user, I did a quick test on all of the knobs just to make sure that we're good to go. Everything works except for the bottom right one, which means it's debug time. There are reasonably 3 different things here that could be wrong. Either it's an issue with the software, an issue with the wiring, or it's the potentiometer itself that's broken. Vote now on your phones. I was pretty confident that it was a wiring issue, and lost about an hour of my life trying to resolder different wires and reroute stuff to not be too close, but ultimately, it was just a bad potentiometer. Luckily, it has now paid for its crimes by being completely dismembered and replaced with an exact replica, which is exactly how I want to go out. Now everything works, we just need to put all the pieces together. Introducing the finished Time Adventure module. The label maker was such a good purchase. It feels so much more professional like this. Plus that little hole next to the eyes for the incidental tempo light is pretty cool. If that didn't happen accidentally, I never would have thought to include it. Let's take this over to the rest of the synth and see what it can do. Right now with the modules I have, the main use for our clock module will be to trigger the envelope module at a consistent tempo. If we add in some random modulation on wave shape and pitch, it starts to sound almost like music. The main thing that we're lacking at this point is melody, so next time I think we'll have to see what we can do about that with a sequencer. But for now, I think we're definitely making steps in the right direction. Thanks for coming along on the journey for this one, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye!